Okay, so yeah, so the video is on, and that's for the online students to get the same exact thing that you face-to-face students are getting. So let's see. The first thing I'm going to ask you is, where did we stop? What was the last thing that we talked about in class on Monday? Because I'm going to pick up right where we left off and review a little bit of it and then move on. Sir?
Suicide and crime went up, addictions.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the bigger topic from that, so we were talking about suicide and crime, which isn't, those aren't happy topics to discuss on the very first day of class, but we were talking about how sociology started, right? Or at least how Emile Durkheim, a really famous sociologist, sort of proved to people by using research. You know, we said sociology is the scientific study or the systematic study of society and human interaction. He sort of proved to people with this research of his that the structure of society, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, social structure. So I'll go ahead and put that on the board. But he proved that the structure of society can and does have an effect on people within that society, their behavior. Okay? So I think I remember we talked a little bit about psychology in class on Monday, because a lot of y'all have had psychology. How many? How many of y'all took psychology? Yeah, tons. Almost every single hand goes up. So a ton of people have psychology, and you talk about human behavior in psychology too, right? The individual and the brain makeup. I remember I monitored or observed a psychology class one time, and the instructor was talking about like the areas of the tongue where you taste bitter or sweet or all those kinds of things. Like, okay, so heads are nodding. I didn't know they covered that in psychology class. I mean, I had it years ago. There wasn't a gray hair on my head, so I don't remember that they talked about that kind of stuff. But anyway, I observed another one. They were talking about therapy, different kinds of therapy techniques. In another class I observed at one point. We don't talk about those kinds of things regarding human behavior in sociology. In sociology, we talk about how society and the individual reacting to society, how that behavior interplay, so to speak, happens. Okay? And so, yeah, so Emile Durkheim, if we were talking about suicide and crime at the end of class on Monday, we were talking about the birth of the study of society, which is the Industrial Revolution. So that topic that you discussed or learned about in history class, multiple times probably, that affected social structure. So before the Industrial Revolution, there was a social structure. It was predominantly small town life, right? What else was characteristic of life for pretty much everybody across the board before Industrial Revolution? Everybody's in everybody's business, right?
They didn't have like a strong police like officer.
You didn't have to have a strong police force either. That's true. Or any kind of like social control agency. I know I'm using fancy words. We're going to talk about what social controls are, maybe every chapter, but in depth in I think chapter 6. And so yeah, in that old-timey social structure where you had a whole bunch of people, but they were scattered about in small towns. Everybody was up in everybody's business, which we don't like the sound of, but that caused what you're talking about, no need really for huge police forces and jails and penitentiaries and electric chairs and stuff like that, right? So is your hand up? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's because they depended on one another.
Yes, there was that interdependence. So the word social network means something probably very different to folks your age, but social network is a long time standing concept. Social networks used to be this interconnection that people have with their townsfolk, their church group, their co-workers, their fraternities and sororities and things like this, right? With social networks now, of course, we expand into the digital realm, right? And people can be in your social network and live all over the world. You know, most of us have multiple countries of people represented in our Instagram followers or who we follow or something like that. So yeah, social networks back then were the glue, kind of. that kept people together. And yeah, you didn't need police for that. Typically, you know, how many of y'all have seen that, the Andy Griffith Show? The Mayberry, you know, he's a sheriff, and then Barney, that's the deputy, right? And they have a jail with like 2 cells in it, and they only ever lock up, you know, the guy who drinks a little too much. I can't remember. Otis, is that his name? Something like that. I don't know. So yeah, that kind of show, even though it wasn't written about life before the Industrial Revolution, it was just written about small town life in America in like the 50s or something, I think is when it was set. That kind of atmosphere is sort of how it was across the board in the social structure before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, the word revolution means massive change, right? So it was about a 100-year process where social structure massively changed. There were still small towns around, but also urbanization had taken place. What's urbanization mean? Do what?
Cities?
It's the process of building cities. So you have a whole bunch of big cities popping up everywhere because the factories, which was the industrialization part, were being built you know, in central locations on waterways or something, someplace where transportation was easy, and social structure changed. Huge amounts of people gathering in these cities, and I don't know you, and I don't know you, and I don't know you. I might have been really friendly back in that small town environment, but I'm looking at you, and you're a stranger, and I'm scared of strangers, and so I'm going to keep to myself, and I don't have that social network, and you don't know my name, and you won't notice if I'm there or not. And we don't have things in common like, oh, I saw you at church, because there's too many churches for us to coincidentally also work at the same factory, also go to the same church, and also live in the same apartment building or something, right? So you live among strangers. It might be 4 million strangers, but you might be the loneliest you've ever been. You know that people are keeping to themselves and kind of staying away from each other on the street as much as we can. So maybe crime is something that you would never consider committing in a small town where everybody's in everybody's business. But now, nobody's going to see. How are they going to describe you? Our behavior pattern has changed. We don't have that social network. And so social structure is essentially the predominant topic that we closed with on Monday if we were talking about Emil Durkheim's study on suicide from the pre-industrial revolution to after. Because social structure changed, and he demonstrated through data, through records, through that systematic research we talked about, he demonstrated that, hey, there were no significant crime rates to speak of before the Industrial Revolution, except in big cities. In the Industrial Revolution, big cities, big crime rate. There were no suicide rates to speak of before, when that small, close-knit social networks existed. Big cities, suicide rate went way up. And we have records, you know, to look at. He looked at
People gambling
records.
their
Do what?
I said people gambling their money.
Maybe, yeah. Lots of different professions started, right? Which, you know, now there's a saloon and a gambling hall and all these kinds of things that contribute to, perhaps, the incidence of crime. Yeah, good point. Okay, so let's talk about social structure today. Chapter 4, I think, we're going to really look into major parts of social structure, but I want you to recall on Monday when we talked about how society has rules that we're supposed to follow and it affects the you and me level. So social structure, we're talking about the macro scale society here. Social structure on the macro scale exists to preserve society, preserve our culture moving forward. Social structure exists as a macro scale thing preserves culture from one generation to the next. It preserves society from one generation to the next. You can even say from one century to the next. So in the US, we have a social structure. And if you go and talk to your grandma and ask your grandma what it was like when she was 20, however old you are, she's going to tell you about a very different sounding personal experience that she had, right? You've done it before, huh? she's going to, maybe you don't even have to ask her. She might be telling you, we didn't do it this way. Yeah, for you also. Yeah, we didn't do it this way when I was your age. This was important to us when I was your age. That was not important to us. This is what I was focused on when I was your age. And she's responding and telling you her personal experience, not because she had entirely a mind of her own, but the social structure that existed when she was your age had different rules associated with it. The rules have changed somewhat, but has social structure stayed relatively the same so that we follow a similar pattern overall, and 100 years from now, it's still going to be the United States, a recognizable United States of America to the people who live there?
Somewhat.
Right? When we go back, yes, it stays relatively stable over time. Change is part of the stability. Would you like it very much if your life was still like what your grandma describes hers was? No, me neither, right? Personal experiences are different. The rules associated with the social structure is different. Those things change over time, right? Okay, so in sociology, the social structure that we're talking about is the macro scale kind of component that we need to think about. So the word social facts that we got on Monday, who's got the definition of that word, social facts? Let's go ahead and review it right now.
Having ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that exist on the micro level and control individuals' behavior.
It should say
Also
macro level, yes.
And control the individual's behavior on the micro level.
On the macro level. Excellent. Yeah, so social facts are patterned ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that exist on the macro scale, but it affects our behavior on the micro scale, okay? So social facts are part of this social structure. And let's call them for a moment institutions. Social institutions. These are macro scale components of the social structure that provide a framework for people about how things ought to be done. Social institutions. Pretty much every vocabulary word starts with the word social in here. Social institutions. They are frameworks that your grandma had to live by, and we have to live by, and your grandkids are going to have to live by. Okay, social institutions. They are frameworks that provide a set of norms. I think Max used that word norms the other day. We'll get to a complex definition of what that word means. But for now, when you hear the word norms, what do you think that means? Norms is the root word of normal. Yeah. Do what?
Average.
Expected. Instead of the word average, let me say expected. It's social rules. Norms are social rules that are considered, like Des said, normal. Expected. Typical is a good word to use. Yeah, so these social institutions, the frameworks we're talking about, are norms. They exist on the macro scale, but they are norms for individual behavior. For instance, an example of a social institution is the education system. the education system as a social institution. It provides a framework for specific things in society, like transmitting knowledge, transmitting cultural awareness, transmitting diversity and tolerance education, and those kinds of things. So the education system as a social institution is a macro scale framework for transmitting knowledge, culture, awareness, those kinds of things. Just gonna wait for everybody to finish writing. Sorry. So there's many examples of social institutions. I've picked the education system to start with, just to kind of get your toes wet with what a social institution is and kind of the parts of this definition, because we've got macro scale parts. Definitely macro scale is represented in this definition of social institutions. But these frameworks that we're talking about that exist on the macro scale, that means these frameworks are the expectation. What are some of the other words you use? The typical behaviors, the normal behaviors that are expected across the board. So the education system, in other words, doesn't just exist in Arkansas or Mississippi or Oklahoma. It's in Montana and Washington State and Idaho and all those places out there too. And come to think of it, Hawaii, wouldn't it be nice if we had happened to be born there? And Alaska, I'm glad I wasn't born there, I think. I don't think I wouldn't like that cold. But the education system here, on a macro scale, the same norms for education exist there that exist in Florida, that exist in Maine, and everywhere in between.
What does that second to last word say?
Culture.
Oh, culture.
Sorry, my messy handwriting.
No, my handwriting's pretty awful myself.
Well, I'll have a contest with you sometime for which one of us has the worst handwriting. So sorry, yes, if you ever, can't read my chicken scratch, please tell me to go more slowly and change, the spelling. Also, I'm a terrible speller. Have you noticed that yet? So please don't let me leave a misspelled word on the board either, please. Yes, sir.
It's the name of the movie I forgot. It's like
Oh, you're thinking.
talking about what we were talking
Oh,
about.
good. Well, then keep on thinking about it. You can share it with us if you'd like to. But if you think of a movie that we're going to talk about, that while we're talking about this topic that you have to learn about anyway to do well on the test, then that's the kind of thing that you can use for an outside source reaction paper. So good. So keep on thinking and share it with us if you'd like, or keep that treasure to yourself, and you can write about it next week. Okay? So, education system is one of these macro scale components. It's a social institution. It's a macro scale component of social structure. And it exists because there is a norm in the United States for every person, every resident must have a certain level of education. Certain level of knowledge and education. Certain level of cultural knowledge and awareness. What is that certain level? The norm for the education system.
High school.
High school is the level right now. High school is the level that we absolutely expect everybody in the U.S. to. Now, does everybody have high school? No. So not everybody does, but the framework is in place to kind of put pressure on everybody, and the laws are in place because the expectation is that you're going to have a high school diploma. There are also laws in place, and so for instance, bless you, whoever that was, another social institution that we could talk about is the government. And the government is certainly linked to the education system, and there are laws within the government that say, hey, how old are you when you have to start school? Anybody know?
Is it 5?
I think five is still the time where you have to start. When I was 6, it used to be 6, and if your parents had money, they could pay to send you to kindergarten. But now, yeah, you have to pay to go to kindergarten when I was little. But that was a long time ago, right? That's not been in y'all's lifetime. So kindergarten has been required, right, in y'all's lifetime. And I think, yeah, the Head Start program starts at 2. Is it 2 or 3, something like that? And pre-K, how many of y'all went to pre-K or are sitting in your, yeah, pre-K is 4, or is it
4 and 5.
4 years old, 4, 5, and then, yeah. So pre-K is not required yet, am I right? It's not required, it's like an option. Okay, so it's an optional. It might be required by the time your kids have kids to put in school. It might be. Okay, so yeah, so these things change over time. I'm going to mention some of the changes because you've noticed changes when you talk to old folks like me and we talk about back in the day for us. It sounds different than back in the day for you because we have a different time frame that we lived in. And even though social structure and the components of social structure remain the same over time, the norms, the specific norms associated with them change over time because every generation has a different social identity and social personality, so to speak. Okay? So the education system. We have a norm that we expect everybody to have a high school education. We don't have 100% high school education, among the general population. Some people never get their high school diploma. But would you say the majority, the vast trend across the board in the United States is that people have their high school diploma? Or the trend in the United States is that people don't have their high school
It's
diploma?
going down because,
A lot of dropouts. A lot of
yeah,
dropouts.
they show it on the news all the time.
Do we have a catch? Do we have a catch for that?
Well,
Do we have a catch? Yeah, so I should maybe clarify myself. Does it mean that you have to actually finish, like go through a graduation ceremony when you're 17 or 18? No. It doesn't mean that you have to do that. Do we have like a catch? Because people do drop out. I mean, we acknowledge not everybody follows norms, right? So for some people, the norms are a hassle. Can't be bothered with them, okay? That's few, though. Those are the exceptions to the rule. And society wants everybody to have this high school education level. And hear me talking about society like it's a person. I told you I would talk about society like it's a person, okay? Like a ruler or something. So society has this norm for all the residents. Not all of us actually finish 12th grade. We drop out before, but society has a safety net for you. And we're going to kind of give you peer pressure, sort of, to get that GED. Does everybody get their GED? No. So it's not a dictatorship where you must. But this social framework is in place to kind of encourage you. And if the people around you are part of the society also, they're going to encourage you too, or pressure you, or whatever the word is, because this is what overall macro level society norm is. Some of the presidential candidates are asking for the first 2 years of college, which y'all are doing now, the first 2 years of college to be paid for also like high school is paid for. What do y'all think?
It's too late now.
Too late for that.
Well, for you, future generations, future. But this is how norms might change even more, So right now we said kindergarten through 12th grade is the normal expectation. Of course, there's some structure. There's what word do I want to say? There's like pressure in the economy. There's pressure in the job market for you to go higher. So one of these days, maybe it is for your kids or your grandkids or something. One of these days, maybe the norm is going to be, grade 14. Are we going to call it that? I don't know. That's what this class is technically. This is like 2 levels above 12th grade, is what this class is supposed to be. And some people do call it grade 14 community college, but
What would grade 13 be?
grade 13 is college algebra and political science and world history and all the 1,000 level 1,000 level classes that you take. Some I think biology is a 1,000 level class. But this is a 2,000 level class, so that's like the second level of college. I think English Comp is a 1,000 level. Anyway, go ahead. You want to say
No,
something?
I was just gonna say, China is like that, but in New York as well, they give away free education.
Oh, well, yeah, we have a whole bunch of scholarship opportunities. Yeah, there's a guy in Harlem. Well, I think he's retired now. His name is Jeffrey Canada. Fabulous guy who essentially follows kids from birth really all the way up through college, gives them mentors to work with their families, work with them to kind of be a contact person to help this particular macro scale pressure to finish school, help it happen, because he noticed, like you were saying, lots of folks are dropping out. He noticed a really high dropout rate in this particular neighborhood, and he was like, how can we fix this? And he developed a, somebody look him up on Google for me really quick. Jeffrey Canada, it's spelled with a G-E-O. Jeffrey Canada, what was the name of his education thing that he had? Anyway, that's a fantastic kind of public service to try to get everybody to attain this. Anybody find it?
You gotta be a resident for like 6 months to get the free school in New York.
Mm-hmm.
You said Jeffrey, right?
Canada is his last name, spelled like the country. But Jeffrey is spelled with a G.
Harlem Children's Zone?
The Children's Zone. Yes, the Harlem Children's Zone. So he took like a whole neighborhood and then expanded it, and he has mentors for everybody who's born, and they follow him through kindergarten, like Head Start, kindergarten, all the way up through middle school, high school, and and tries to place them in college and get them funding for college. And anyway, so you can look at, and there's tons of things. I mean, I just remember really, really liking Jeffrey Canada's model when it was introduced years ago. But there are a whole bunch of programs, such as somebody mentioned, I think you mentioned Head Start, which is not technically part of the public school system, but it's one of those programs that contributes. It exists because it supplements or complements, whatever the word is, it supplements this education system to try to get people ready to succeed.
Kindergarten, another one.
Yeah, there's lots of different ones. Okay, so there's tons of social institutions, and we will look at many, many more than just the education system. I think in one section of your textbook, early on, like in your reading assignment, it uses family as an example of a social institution. So let me talk about this when you see family. So we know the difference between macro sociology and micro sociology, right? What's the difference?
Macro is dealing with a bigger
Macro is dealing with
individuals.
Yes, so macro is dealing with the big picture, trends across the board. Micro is dealing with me and you level, okay? So social institutions are macro scale parts of society. And I'm telling you that family exists as a social institution, okay? So family as a social institution, this is about the norms for what a family does. I'm going to say lowercase family, like an individual microscale family. There are norms for what a family does and what a family is supposed to, I'm going to put supposed in quotation marks, supposed to be like. There are norms for, historically, there are norms for what a family is supposed to be like, including who makes up a, look at my air quotes, typical family, right? When I say typical family, what comes to mind? A mom, dad, kids. You have a number of kids?
Like 2 or 3.
2 or 3, but not 7? No, that's not typical, right? Okay, so when you think of typical family, typical mom, dad, kids. That's the norms on the macro scale. It serves a purpose. It serves a purpose. When I say breadwinner, who am I talking about in that typical family? When I say caregiver, who am I talking about in that typical family? So, do children, who you also said were part of this, do they cost money? So do we need a breadwinner? Can they watch themselves? So do we need a caregiver? So that's the structure, right? And I think we talked about single parent households in class on Monday for just a little bit. And extra governmental support for people who are in single parent households. Is that because maybe society is structured where the expected family composition is the two parents and the kids that you're talking about, because the two parents have different roles, different norms that they're supposed to fulfill for the needs of the children that they are supposed to have? Why are you supposed to have? Family is composed of children. Why does society need children to be born? To continue. To continue. People are gonna die. There's a reality.
Life cycle.
Life cycle. People are gonna die. If you don't have at least as many babies being born as people dying, your society dying. And that's the truth. You can look at Japan right now. You can look at South Korea. Please do. You can see birth trends, birth rates are going way down, and guess what? People are dying at the same rate as expected. And so what's going to happen to their society after a while? Bye-bye. Unless something changes. Okay? So family has a purpose on the macro scale. Y'all told me typical family was mom, dad, kids. Those kids have a function. Those kids have a purpose in the social structure. We're not going to have a society to have a structure of if we don't have kids being born. And since those kids can't take care of themselves, the norms in our society is that the caregivers do it. One of them's called breadwinner, one of them's called caregiver or nurturer, those words, typically. Again, I keep using typical because that's the macro scale standard. Now, if we went around the room to talk about what my family structure at home, my individual family structure at home looked like, compared to yours, probably none of us would have the same thing. Probably none of us would have the same thing. All of us, however, know this norm, right?
Similarities.
All of us know, we would have some similarities, probably. Some people, our caregivers, are actually technically, if you look at family tree, our grandparents. Are actually technically, if you look at family tree, my uncle, right? Are actually technically, I was adopted, right? Actually, there's 7 foster kids in this household, right? So our structure, our society has a whole bunch of examples that we can witness that kind of try to closely mimic, as closely as possible, mimic this norm when we don't match that norm, right? So the daycare industry, I heard somebody talk about that a minute ago. The daycare industry is booming. Booming. Because dad's not the only breadwinner anymore in a 2-parent household. There's 2 breadwinners often in a 2-parent household. And many households are not 2 parents at all. And so mom or dad, whoever is the single parent, still has to work, and kids still can't watch themselves after school lets out, right? Until they're a certain age. You gotta pay somebody else to do it. You will get in trouble if you send your 5-year-old home alone for 4 hours until you get home from work. Right? So society has these things in place where we can make observations on the micro scale. Do you see how we've done that? Observations on the micro scale and tied them back up to societal level expectations. The family contributes to the economy, the family contributes to the education system, and the education system complements the family's needs for somebody to take care of the kids, right? Public schools take care of them for a large part of the day. Right? It might benefit families quite a lot if public school was mandatory at 2. Might benefit a lot. I think 2 is when Head Start starts. So, okay. So talk to me for a second. Do you see, are you making these connections? Am I going too fast? We're good? Okay. So macro, micro connections, the sociological imagination that we talked about on Monday, that's what we're working toward here. The first 3 of our 4 course learning outcomes is what we're talking about here. Okay? Okay, speak up if you have any comments or questions while I am erasing. Okay, good. Silence means understanding, right? Should I assume silence means understanding? Okay. So there are 3, now we're going to talk about how sociologists look at this information. There are 3 common ways. They are called theoretical perspectives. They are 3 theoretical perspectives. What's a perspective? A point of view, a way of looking at something. So there is no fancy redefinition of the word perspective here, like we had to redefine a couple of things in our vocabulary on Monday. A perspective is a point of view, it's a way of looking at something. So there's 3 different theoretical perspectives that we have in sociology class. Does everybody have the same perspective? No. So these 3 perspectives are just general umbrella kind of ways of looking at things that most sociologists pick from. They'll pick 1, they'll pick 2 they like, they'll overlap some, but these perspectives give us a way, give sociologists a way of analyzing, asking questions about society and analyzing the data that we get when we're doing our systematic research. So these give us kind of a standpoint to write questions or to ask questions about why stuff is the way that it is in society. Okay? So there's 3 ways. I'm not going to tell you which one is my favorite, because my favorite that should not matter in your decision as to which one makes the most sense to you. Also, let me clarify that your textbook discusses 4 theoretical perspectives. I'm going to leave the one out that is commonly not used anymore. It's kind of not used anymore.
What was it?
It is called postmodernism. And it's interesting, but a lot of sociologists aren't using it too much anymore, and the frameworks that my colleagues and I got from the society, the sociological national group, don't even list it anymore as a valid perspective. Other social sciences use it. But anyway, so you'll read about it in your textbook, but I'm going to only give you 3 here, and you'll have, we'll focus on 3 moving forward instead of 4. I'm just going to go the order that they're presented in the textbook. The first one is called Functionalism.
Miss, isn't that in the chapter 2?
It should be in chapter 1, but if it's in chapter 2, sorry, that's part of the reading assignment anyway, so I thought it was in chapter 1, but it doesn't matter. It's in your reading assignment someplace. Okay? Yeah, so functionalism, another word that this sometimes is called is structural functionalism, because it looks at social structure, it looks at that level. So if functionalists look at the structural level of society, is this a micro-sociology perspective or a macro-sociology perspective? Macro. So functionalism is macro. Okay? So you can look at you and me examples, but you only look at you and me examples to kind of get answers to bigger trends across the board, society as a whole, because that's what macro-sociology means, right? Okay, so functionalism is one of the 3 perspectives that says all the parts of the social system, the social structure, work for stability and order of society overall. All the parts of the social system that we live in. A functionalist says that they are designed the way that they're designed, those social institutions that we just talked about, those frameworks for behavior, frameworks for expectations. A A functionalist would say those are designed the way they are, with the norms associated with them that are associated with them, because it keeps society stable over time, plugging along, so century after century we've got society. Change is part of, you okay? Okay, change is part of that social structure.
Inedible.
Change is part of that social structure over time. Back to things are different than what grandpa tells you were reality for him. But a functionalist said that all these parts of society, like we just talked about, let me see, we talked mainly about the education system, right? But we also had the government on the board at one point, right? And we also had family on the board at one point as macro scale parts of society. So, why did I draw these kind of arrows in between these things as I...
Everything is learned.
They follow the triangle thing
Everything is learned, but they do follow the, what'd you say?
too. They follow each other.
I think she said they follow the triangle thing. But yes, they do affect each other. They follow each other, they build from each other, they're interconnected.
Family has to listen to the government. The government goes by the education system. They learn from their
And all, everything, yes. So family structure, that typical family again, has a link to laws. It has a link to policies. When lawmakers make policies, they usually talk about how something is going to affect this kind of family, a socioeconomic level. Have you heard middle class being used a whole lot in the political system? They'll talk about middle class families. How is this tax law going to affect families, right? And the education system affects families. It keeps up with your teenager so that they're not out doing whatever kind of shenanigans that they'd get into if they were left unsupervised at 14 and 15, right? Yeah, so family is dependent upon education system. We can throw economics in here. The economy is another social institution. And a functionalist looks at these things and says, life is structured like this because this structure, this framework, helps society exist as an orderly kind of stable thing over time. So functionalists kind of like society the way that it is. They say things are working pretty good. Let's leave it that way. So if there is a part of society that exists and we haven't cut it out of society yet, we haven't gotten rid of it, it's probably because it's contributing in a positive way to the stability and order of society. Does that make sense? Some people are frowning. Okay, so let me ask you this question. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, so basically, I believe society kind of works itself out.
Uh-huh. I guess they would say society kind of works itself out. Here's a topic we were discussing on Monday, apparently. Does crime exist on a macro scale across society? Do we see it everywhere?
Yes.
Okay, so it's a part of the social system that we live in, right? Crime is a reality on the macro scale in the social system we live in. Do we think of crime as a positive thing?
No,
Well,
it just
okay, it depends on what?
I mean,
They
you
make
could-
money on
Ooh, okay. So is crime
judicial system.
on the macro scale is crime related to the economy?
I think it's like $1.5 or $8 million per person a year. They get
It's a
for
lot.
private-
Yes, there's a lot of government funding. There's a lot of private donations. There's a lot of jobs that are created because crime exists. You're absolutely right. So even when we think about a thing like crime that we can say to ourselves, oh yeah, that's a macro scale thing. You see that everywhere. That's a trend across the board. We see that everywhere. We don't think of crime as a good thing. On the micro scale, you get nipped. You're not gonna think it's a good thing if they snag you, right? You're not gonna think that it's, you're not having a very good personal experience. But on the macro scale, crime, you have a really solid argument that crime is part of our social structure, and we leave it as part of our social structure because it's a huge industry. And I don't know, I mean, you're throwing some numbers out in the millions, it might even be billions that that the industry is every
Some
single
folks
year.
say
That's another
so.
thing we can ask Siri about, right? Do what?
I said some whole stations run off straight private.
Absolutely. So there's private prisons, there's state-run prisons, and there's staff that has to run that, and there's food production that has to happen, and somebody has to do the laundry, and there's all kinds of jobs. And we're not even talking about the court system yet, right? Social workers too, right? There's a whole bunch of different jobs that that occur in our society because crime exists and it's part of our social system. What about this? Another thing that is related to the economy. Is poverty something we can observe across the board?
Yep.
Do we think of it as a good thing?
No.
No, it sucks from personal experience, let me just tell you. So, but it's part of the social system. If it was not keeping society stable and orderly, you think we'd get rid of it? But how? I mean, how can it contribute to stability and order in society?
It has to do with grunt work.
Oh, it does have to do with grunt work, like you said. However, we have a technical term for that in sociology. It's called dirty jobs. Not the TV show, but a sociology term from long ago. The grunt work, right? We have a ton of jobs that need to be done on a macro scale across the board. We need a ton of kinds of grunt work jobs to be done. And are you in college classes with me right now? Or are you in grade 14 or whatever we want to call this in order to do grunt jobs? No. But do we need somebody hungry enough, needing money enough for the rent to do the grunt jobs? Yes, because honestly the world operates a lot on grunt jobs. Right? We would really notice, we would not have stability and order, those grunt jobs weren't getting done. Okay? And also, does poverty create jobs, other jobs that are not grunt work jobs? Like what?
Like rebuilding at least the poverty neighborhoods and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Because poverty exists, there's a whole bunch of agencies that work on all kinds of projects to try to improve poverty existence. There's private and public food banks, there's homeless shelters, there's organizations like Habitat for Humanity, like you made me think of it, the comment that you made. So yes, there's all kinds of components of society. A functionalist would say that all of these things are connected. I didn't draw this in a way where the arrows would be very pretty if I tried to make arrows about all the connections that they have. But a functionalist calls society a system because all these things are connected, right? All of them are. And a functionalist says, even if there's a part of society that doesn't seem like it's a good thing, we need to see if we can analyze it from the perspective of, hey, what good does it do? Because if it's there, we probably have developed some kind of way to use it for good for the stability and order of the system moving on. Does that make sense?
The human ecosystem, essentially.
Into that too, yes.
Who is to decide if the way that things are working is good?
A functionalist has the point of view that if we, like the controlling population in the century that we're talking about, leaves it, well, okay, let's talk about the 1%ers in the next perspective that I tell you about. But the people in power, a functionalist would say that people who are in power because of, like, can I use natural selection as an explanation, kind of social selection, because they're the most fit for that. And so if it was something that was so bad that we wanted to cut it out, we could cut it out. But if we don't cut it out, it's because we can analyze some kind of positivity for it. That's the functionalist perspective. If you don't like that, wait for the two other perspectives because maybe you'll like one more. Is that a sufficient answer? Okay. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the second perspective, and And these perspectives, by the way, I do want you to ask a whole bunch of questions, because the first project that you're going to do in sociology class, remember we have 4 tests, 100 points each, 2 projects, 50 points each. The first project is coming up pretty quick now. Probably the end of next week I'll give you a due date for it. And I will ask you to choose one of these 3 perspectives. The one that makes the most sense to you, or 2 perspectives. Sometimes people overlap perspectives because they like the micro side of it and also explaining the macro scale association. So anyway, take good notes and don't let me move on to the next perspective if any of you have any questions that you want to clear up about functionalist or functionalism. If another question comes up about functionalism when we're talking about the differences between it and this one, please, ask a bunch of questions so you get that info in your notes, okay? Okay, so the second of the 3 theoretical perspectives that we're going to talk about, number 2, is called conflict theory. Conflict theory. Social conflict theory is another way it's worded. So if you're doing any research, like on sociology.com or Quizlet or something, you might see social conflict theory. Same thing. It is a perspective. It is a way of analyzing society. It also takes the macro level point of view. So it looks at all the same things that a functionalist just looked at, but it looks at them in a very different way. Okay. So conflict theorists say social structure has evolved over time to benefit the haves and disadvantage. Markers running out. And disadvantage, well, that one's, I think I can make it from here. I won't try. I'll hit somebody in the head. There we go. Disadvantage the have-nots. Y'all heard of these 2? Okay, yeah. These are common phrases. They are associated in sociology. They are associated with conflict theory. In economics, they are usually associated with wealthy and impoverished, or like you said a minute ago, the 1% and the 99%. Who would the 1% be? The haves. And who would the 99% be? The have-nots. Right. Okay. So conflict theorists would look at all those same things, and they would say, like, let me see, we had education system, we had family, we had government, and then what we had, economy, but let's put, the other one we had, that was okay. So I'll put these in kind of like a symbol format too, but instead of looking at these things as complementary to each other, and that's okay, conflict theory would say the link between the family and the education system and the economy and the government is very hurtful for low-income families and advantageous for upper-income families. They would look at macro-scale social structures. For instance, how is the education system funded? Does anybody know? It is off of taxes. I guess I should have been more specific with my question. Yes, taxes fund the public education system, and taxes fund the student loan system and Pell Grants and stuff like that. But in K through 12 schools, anybody know the specific kind of taxes that are going? What'd you say? Property taxes. Property taxes means how much is your house worth, and the property that your house is on. And that is evaluated and reevaluated from time to time. The census that is about to happen is going to be part of the process to reevaluate the value of what you own as far as your real estate property. So then if the real estate where you live, where you own, or where your mortgage is, or where you're paying rent, if where you're paying rent has low-income houses in a part of town that doesn't have very expensive houses around it and has low income, there might be tons of families that live there, but low taxes collected to fund the school that serves that area. If you live on another, I've got some people who have unfortunately had to study this kind of sad reality in the past, according to the conflict perspective. So if you look at high-income areas, maybe you've got, 5-acre places and these big houses and they're separated by privacy fences or whatever, like the value of the property is much higher, then your taxes are going to be much higher, but it's going to go to a school that usually services those people too. And so you end up with low-income family schools with low resources and upper-income family schools with higher resources. Ever heard of that before? So that's the way that it's structured. We got to fund education. That was the most logical way to fund it. But does that create fairness in outcomes? It doesn't create fairness in outcomes. So what have we done over time to kind of fix this? A functionalist, remember, we talked about some things that are not nice in society, like crime and poverty. Functionalists don't want to do anything to fix it because we look at the positive impact that those things have on the macro scale overall. A conflict theorist would find something that shows inequality. This is all about where is the source of the inequality. The root start of the inequality. From the macro scale, we want to know macro scale, that's supposed to be an arrow, macro scale source of the inequality. That's what a conflict theorist wants to know. A conflict theorist says the source is at the macro scale. We can't just fix it for one neighborhood and have that fix the problem. I told you a minute ago about Jeffrey Canada. He fixed a problem of low educational attainment in low-income neighborhoods. He fixed it for that neighborhood. He did a fabulous thing, completely turned the statistics around. But does that fix it for everybody else who's not in that particular neighborhood? No. So he did a wonderful thing insofar as he could do it. But a conflict theorist says, okay, at the macro level, where is the problem? How can we fix it? So anybody know what some of the fixes have been? What some of the tries, when they have tried to fix certain things? Anybody know what some of them have been over time?
There's a Title IX. There's certain things.
There are certain governmental interventions, which, like for instance, if the haves and have-nots are males and females, Title IX gives like just as many opportunities for females in education and sports. That's correct. That's one of the interventions.
There's another one other like
There is.
I can't remember.
And then what about busing and to different school districts, or school vouchers to try to go to the one that you want? So for instance, there was a big, what's the word I'm looking for? A push in like the 1970s because this came to light. Schools are funded with vastly different amounts of resources based on these property taxes. And so in order to fix that, some people from this part of town could be bused to this part of town in order to take advantage, and these people could be bused to this, so that we can count by children's head and distribute the money a little bit differently. Tried it. Yes, ma'am.
So for an example, my family and I moved from Alexander to Bauxite, and I was like in like the last 2 years of high school. My parents fought for me to stay in Bryant School District. However, my little sister sadly had to go to Bauxite.
Yeah, so see the school districts that you're talking about were redrawn to try to correct some of this, so we don't have neighborhood schools anymore where you've got like a school that only serves Hurricane Lakes or something, right? And a school that only serves, yeah, so you do have, but it's still based on address, as you just pointed out, because they could negotiate where you could stay, but she was of an age where she had to go through the system differently. Right, so see, there's these safety nets, kind of, just like I had the GED on the board as a safety net because we want to get everybody through high school. There are some safety nets, but the laws, and a conflict theorist would say this, the laws in the government that affect all of these different areas and more tend to have a bias that advantages some and disadvantages others. Okay, so who are the haves and who are the have-nots? It depends on what advantage and disadvantage you are talking about. Okay? Are you talking about male advantage, female disadvantage, for instance, in Title IX, like you mentioned, can make up for that? So not, all the sports money doesn't just go to male sports, but we got some female sport money allocated also to let females have an opportunity, for instance. Yes?
Isn't evolve kind of like, I'd say, an incorrect term to put in the definition? Because that's kind of basically how the whole United States started, was benefit for one half and non-benefit for another half.
No, it started with that seed because it wasn't like born anew, really, like we hear. It was an import from the system in Europe. But evolve here means change.
So I guess it could be
So
negative
changed
evolve.
over time. Social structure has changed over time. Or even, as you're pointing out, the patriarchy from Europe was transplanted here. The religious attitudes and patriarchy and those kinds of things were transmitted here. So from the starting point, in this case, you're absolutely correct. From the United States standpoint, we started out with vast differences between the haves and the have-nots. Yes, and so it does continue to change over time from the point of view from the conflict perspective. It changes over time to continue to benefit the haves, continue to disadvantage
So it's like,
the have-nots.
It
Yeah.
wasn't like that and it changed to be that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you asked that question because that was the wrong impression for me to give. So no, maybe a society started out disadvantaged and continues to progress with advantages for this and disadvantages for that. And a conflict person who uses the conflict perspective is going to examine it every step of the way and try to get to the root of that inequality and try to fix it. Some things like busing maybe is just a Band-Aid to try to fix it, right? Some things like redistricting maybe is just a Band-Aid to try to fix it, or state control of a school district like we're talking about in the Little Rock School District right now, is maybe just a Band-Aid to fix it. So the root cause at the macro level, conflict theorists work to change so that there is less of a difference between these two categories of people and maybe no difference between these two categories of people moving forward. One more comment, and I think we are sadly out of time.
I want to say, sports now, they started to make it to where it's more competitive co-ed now. Guys can
I know.
do
So
it.
now some of the
Guys
sports are
can-
co-ed.
The
Exactly.
Guys can be in the girls' sports and girls can be in the guys'
Mhm.
sports now, and they can wrestle against
You
each
know,
other. It's crazy.
When you talk about macro level, and we can think about this with the Super Bowl coming up, conflict theorists have often fussed about the structure of the National Football League. It's a corporation. It's a private business. It's not a government industry. And you know how it has owners and it has players? Well, the last time we had owners and something else, they weren't called players, they were called slaves. And so this vocabulary even that's used is something that a conflict theorist would say, we've got to get this mentality out, at the macro scale. So anyway, yeah, there's some interesting perspectives from the functionalist side, interesting comments from the conflict side. We will go over the third one on Monday, okay?
These football players are definitely not slaves. I mean, if it's good.
Yeah.